Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Education Budgeting 101, the status of funding and programs. I am Sarah Abernathy. I'm the Executive Director of the Committee for Education Funding. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit coalition of more than 110 different education associations and institutions that together advocates for a greater federal investment along the education continuum from early ed, K through 12, higher ed, career technical education and adult education, and other out of school time educational services, including museums, libraries, educational research, after school programs. And today I have with me several CEF members who are experts in their areas, and we wanted to give a very general overview of status of education funding so far and that will look for the future, and then a little bit of a deeper dive into two areas where there's been a lot of change in education funding in the last year. So I will turn it over to CEF's Vice President, Nicole Fuller from the National Center for Learning Disabilities to do introductions. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm really honored to introduce our panelists today. It will be a great panel discussion, and we'll have some time for questions at the end and lots of important information. So first up is Dr. Rachel Dinkes. She is the president and CEO of the Knowledge Alliance. For the last 4 years, Dr. Rachel Dinkes has been in this role at the Knowledge Alliance, which is a coalition of education organizations that focuses on policy and funding that impacts education research and the use of effective evidence-based practices. She spent the last 17 years at the American Institutes for Research, working on projects supporting the Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics, or NCES. Dr. Dinkes was an author on multiple editions of The Condition of Education, the Digest of Education Statistics, and Indicators of School Crime and Safety. She was also the project director and co-author with NCES on the 2019 seminal congressionally mandated report, Study of the Title I Part A program, Mathematical Formulas. She also served as a United States delegate to the Three Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, education groups. Dr. Dinkes received her PhD from George Washington University and her master's degree from the London School of Economics. So very excited to hear what you have to say about education research and investments in that today. Our next panelist is Xiomara Santos. Xiomara is the Executive Director of Government Relations at the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, where she leads federal advocacy efforts on behalf of more than 600 Hispanic serving institutions, or HSIs for short. She directs HACU's engagement with Congress to advance higher education policy and funding priorities. She's previously held roles at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Hilltop Public Solutions, and the League of United Latin American Citizens, and currently serves on the board of directors of Capital City Public Charter School here in Washington, D.C. She earned her bachelor's degree from Coastal Carolina University. So great to have you, Xiomara, and to share more about the higher education perspectives. And last but not least, we have Sarah Abernathy, who I think for most folks on this call really needs no introduction because if you are a CEF member or a Hill staffer, you have no doubtly worked with Sarah because she has been with CEF for the last decade and has previously spent close to 30 years working in both Congress and the administration, including 18 years on the House Budget Committee Democratic staff, focusing on budget issues related to education, social services, and job training. Earlier in her career, she spent 6 years as a legislative assistant for several House members and 4 years at the U.S. Department of Education that included stints detailed to the Office of Management and Budget and to the Department of Health and Human Services. Sarah graduated from Williams College and earned a master's in public affairs from the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. So we have a really fantastic panel today. We'll get right into the discussion. And with that, I will pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Nicole. And I'm going to use everyone's first name because I know all of you. So um, I thought I would start off by talking a little bit about the overall education funding scenario and where we are. My colleague Jamie, who you may not be able to see, is going to run the slides. If you could put up the first slide, that would be great. Um, when I talk about education funding, I tend to use the Department of Ed as a pretty good proxy, although there's obviously funding that for education that occurs outside of the Department of Ed. This chart shows for the last 15 years or so, the yellow line showing regular appropriations for the Department of Ed. So it doesn't include student loan funding. And you can see that from 2011 to 2018, funding was actually lower than it had been, or from 2012 onward, only reached the 2011 level back in 2018. And that is because there were statutory spending caps in place that really depressed non-defense discretionary funding and education funding in particular. The green line shows what the funding level would be each year if the funding had kept pace with inflation from 2011. And you can see that we are currently in 2026, the last enacted funding, more than $20 billion below the 2011 level in inflation adjusted dollars. So funding for the Department of Ed has not kept up. That is where we are right now. The next slide, please. I thought I would talk a little bit about some of the changes that have happened in the last year. My biggest sort of description of what has happened to education funding is there's been a lot of chaos and uncertainty about when funding will be enacted, when funding will be provided, what funding will be provided for what program, and whether Congress and the public will know about it. One of the concerns I have is for something that I've been trying to trademark jokingly, but I'm referring to as a silent rescission, which is not something when the administration asks Congress to officially rescind money that is enacted, but when the administration just doesn't spend funding, i.e., it holds it back for various programs. And we have seen that in the last year or so. Another thing that has happened that has not happened in the past is unilateral transfers that the Department of Ed has made among programs. So even though Congress provided funding for certain programs, the Department of Ed said we actually prefer to use it for something else, and they've done that. Another thing that they have done that has really impacted funding and impacted the ability of grantees and states to be able to count on the federal funding is using the power to withhold funding or withdraw funding as a cudgel to enforce compliance with the administration's stated priorities. And it is absolutely acceptable for an administration to say what its priorities are, and they tend to change from administration to administration. But the announcement of an executive order does nothing to change the underlying law that says this what a program is enacted to do, what is authorized to do or not to do, and the appropriations law that says the money is provided for that program. So this last year, we've seen money being withheld from specific school districts, from specific institutions, from whole states, because the administration doesn't like something that entity is doing or is refusing to do. Another key thing that you can't ignore is that half the Department of Ed is gone compared to when the Trump administration came in. And the mass layoffs, the offers of early retirement, the striking, the elimination of all the probationary employees, this was not done in a way that was targeted to achieve certain purposes. The purpose was to reduce the number of staff. And CEF focuses on funding. And I just find it impossible to believe that the Department of Ed can provide the technical assistance, the oversight, the protection of students and schools, civil and rights, all the things that is charged to do with half the staff that was there. And we'll hear more from Rachel about, I think, some of the impact that the mass layoffs at the Institute of Education Sciences have had. In addition to the executive orders, there have been lawsuits challenging many of the administration's actions, and the conflicting rulings have left uncertainty again about what happens when one judge initially puts a stay of action against something, and then a district court says no, it can go through, and then a federal appeals court says no, it can't go through, and then maybe the Supreme Court rules a different way. It leaves a lot of uncertainty about what to expect next in terms of rulings. And The end result of all of these changes is uh, to make states, colleges, other grantees not sure that they can count on the federal funding. And if they can't count on the federal funding, they're going to enact budgets for the future year that will not rely on that federal funding. And inevitably, that means that there's less funding for K through 12, career technical, adult, higher ed, all the different research, the things that we thought that that Congress had appropriated funding for. There's one other big thing that has changed in the education funding landscape, and it is the interagency agreements that the department has made with three other agencies to transfer the management of education programs to those other agencies. Can I have the next slide, please? So this table, this chart lists, it's not a very exciting chart, but it lists some of the big programs that have been transferred to other agencies. At this point, $33 billion, it's about 40% of the Department of Ed's total funding has been transferred to the Department of Labor to run. Technically, it hasn't been transferred. The agreements say that the management and the funding will take place in these agencies, but the program continues to exist in the Department of Ed. In December, Department of Ed announced that it was detailing some of its staff in higher ed to the Department of Labor to help them run the higher ed programs. To date, we have not heard about them detailing staff to HHS or Department of State or Interior to run the programs there. And so there's a lot of question about how these will run, whether the grants management platforms for these other agencies can handle the funding, whether the grantees will know who and where to look for the announcements, and whether they will be able to draw down their funding. The last bullet here shows that still at Ed, $44 billion worth of programs, and that $44 billion is really mostly two very large programs. It's Pell Grants, which is the Department of Ed's largest discretionary program, and Special Ed, which is the third largest program. Title I is the second largest. And then, of course, there's the Student Aid Administration and a couple other higher ed programs and some of the professional offices, the management offices. Can I have the next slide, please? What's looking ahead to fiscal year 27 appropriations, because Congress, the president signed into law fiscal year 26 just last month, and already the fiscal year 27 appropriations process has started. There is not any budget request from the administration. We have heard that it may be coming to Congress the week of March 30th. I heard someone say they thought maybe it would be Friday, April 3rd. I will point out that that means the administration is submitting a request to Congress when Congress is in the middle of a 2-week recess. Good Friday, and in the right as Passover has started. So right as a lot of people are not paying attention to things, means that Congress will not be immediately able to hold hearings with the administration on the budget request, but presumably that will happen later. It is still time for members, the House and Senate members, to submit requests either for programmatic funding or language, or in the case of the Senate, for earmarks, congressionally directed spending, to the Appropriations Committee. The House Appropriations Committee extended the deadline that was tomorrow. Now members have until March 27th to submit requests for the Labor HHS Education Ed program bill, and the Senate just announced yesterday the schedule for all their bills deadlines, and the one for Labor HHS Ed is April 21st. It does allow senators to make requests for congressionally directed spending. The two interesting things to me that I think will be bookmarks around how the education funding process happens this year is that there are no statutory caps on discretionary spending for fiscal year 27. There's no arbitrary cap that Congress had to adhere to. So it can set whatever levels it wants for each of the 12 appropriations bills. There's a 302A allocation. These are budget terms. That's the total for the Appropriations Committee. And there's a 302B allocations, which are the 12 subcommittees. It is not uncommon for the House and Senate to have different allocations, which makes the conferencing process later more difficult, of course. The other really significant aspect for this year is that the need for Pell Grant funding has grown dramatically. The program was through the FAFSA simplification. FAFSA's, oh my gosh, I may get the acronym wrong. Federal application, free application for federal student aid was revised a couple years ago, and it made it easier for more people to apply and qualify for larger Pell Grants. And then also Congress expanded the program to accommodate a new workforce Pell program for the first year this year. And the combination of those two things, along with possibly economic environment that makes more people want to apply for federal aid, means that the costs of the program have increased fairly dramatically. And Congress will have to provide a lot more. They have to provide some to backfill what is expected to be a shortfall of what was provided for fiscal year 26, and then also increase costs from fiscal year 27. There's a lot of different things that Congress can do. It can provide that funding through appropriations. It can provide that funding through some other bill, directing mandatory funding to support the program, which it's done often in the past. In the budget reconciliation bill last year that cut hundreds of billions of dollars over 10 years from the student loan program, it directed 10.5 billion of it to the Pell Grant program. There could be other bills that direct funding. Another option, which we are not encouraging and we are really opposed to, would be to cut the maximum grant or to cut eligibility for the grant. So there is no clear path for what Congress will do. If I had to prognosticate, I would say that there may be some markups this spring and summer. The labor HHS ed bill tends to go last. I would be surprised if you saw floor votes this summer. I think it's pretty clear that Congress assumes that there will have to be some sort of continuing resolution in September, because they will not have finalized any or all of the bills before September 30th. Typically, in an election year, Congress recesses in October and then comes back in a lame duck session and finalizes the appropriations bills. Next chart, please. And I have two more that are very fast. This shows you how the colored bars show you how much each president has proposed in their budget request to change the Department of Ed's funding. The blue bars show what Congress actually did. And you can see that Obama and Biden proposed smallish or biggish increases for Department of Ed, and Congress responded in most years by providing fairly small increases. The first Trump administration proposed pretty significant cuts, and Congress provided the same pretty smallish increases. Last year, the president requested the largest cut ever, 12.4 billion, and Congress very slightly increased funding. We don't yet know what there will be for 2027. I'm encouraged that Congress has continued to provide funding for Department of Ed. I would like it to be much more. And my final slide, please. Want to point out that all the changes at the Department of Ed and all the attempts to cut funding, the House Appropriations Committee last year produced a bill that Congress never voted on that would have really significantly cut funding as well. This is not what the public wants. In poll after poll, people say that they want more funding and not less. So that is the end of my sort of overview. I'm happy to answer questions at the end. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Xiomara to talk about funding for Hispanic serving institutions or minority serving institutions.
Thank you, Sarah. And then I'll just wait on the slides. So hi, everyone. My name is Xiomara Santos, and I serve as the Executive Director of Government Relations for HACU, the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. And I'm going to touch on the timeline of everything that has happened in regards to minority serving institution funding, but HACU tends to focus on HSI's Hispanic serving institutions, so that those are some of the examples that I'll pull from. I'm going to start with June, but I do want to note that there were events that had happened prior to June, as early as January 2025, when we saw executive orders. We saw things like grants cancellations from different agencies outside of the Department of Education when it comes to HSI funding. And another example is sometime in February, the U.S. Department of Agriculture wanted to eliminate a HSI fellowship program, but then quickly reinstated that fellowship program. Until this day, it does exist. So just wanted to note that before jumping into this timeline. So one of the biggest things that happened in 2025 is that a lawsuit was filed in Tennessee. The Tennessee Attorney General and Students for Fair Admissions joined forces in challenging the legality of the Hispanic Serving Institution program. It sued the Department of Education. Haku, who is a big champion of the HSI program, very early on knew, based on the current administration's actions, that it was going to be very unlikely for the Department of Education to defend the program in court. And so between June and July, we spoke to several counsel to figure out next steps and how Haku can take action. And so in July, we joined forces with Latino Justice and they joined the case as a pro bono counsel on behalf of Haku. Later that month, we filed a motion to intervene to defend the HSI program and represent the interests of all Hispanic serving institutions that are impacted by this lawsuit. In July as well, that next day, the U.S. Department of Justice declined to defend the HSI program. However, that decision wasn't made public until August 22nd through the media. And then later in the summer, the U.S. Department of Education requested an extension to respond to the complaint. And so that resulted in their deadline being moved to October 2nd. Next slide, please. And during the second half of the year, September 10th was actually the start of Hispanic Serving Institution Week, a week that we recognize the accomplishments of HSIs and the benefits of what these grants have resulted in. And so on September 10th, right before HSI Week, the Department of Education announced that it was going to cut over $350 million in federal grants to MSIs, which includes Hispanic serving institutions, and it reprogrammed it to other programs the administration viewed more favorable, such as HBCUs, TCUs, etc. And this created resulted in a lot of response from higher ed associations, members of Congress. So September 17th is where I'll later on share the links to these letters. It's actually available on the Haku website, and all of these letters that I'm referencing are available in one web page. September 17th is when you see a letter from organizations that represent predominantly Black institutions, ANAPEZs, and HSIs joined together to send letters to Congress opposing these actions. Shortly after, you also see Senate and House Approve Committee members voice their opposition to these cuts. And then that same day, over 170 HSIs, emerging HSIs, and higher ed organizations joined forces to send letters across the Hill. Next slide, please. September 23, still going with what actions we've seen in Congress. Over 80 members on the House of Representatives sent a letter to Department of Ed expressing their strong concern regarding the MSI rescissions. A week later, Department of Ed issued a letter in regards to the lawsuit that challenged the HSI program, saying that it agrees with the plaintiffs, so the plaintiff Students for Fair Admissions, saying that it would not defund the HSI program. So shortly after that, you have members of Senate help sending a letter to Ed noting that the decision was made absent of a court ruling and also that it disrupts the fiscal stability of thousands of colleges and universities across the country that educate millions of students of all ethnicities and background. That same week, you have the Congressional Hispanic Conference, which are the Hispanic Republican lawmakers calling on the Department of Ed to resume funding for HSI programs. And in that letter, they highlight HSIs in Texas, Florida, Washington, etc. Next slide, please. So a lot has happened. And so October 10th is when Haku heard back from the court and we were granted third-party intervention. So we now have a voice in the lawsuit. Haku can now defend the HSI program. And so between October and December, there's a lot of legal jargon that I do not know, but a lot happened in the legal world. I'm not a lawyer. But December 2nd is when Haku filed its motion to dismiss a plaintiff intervener's complaint, and that references other third-party interveners that joined the suit, but in favor of Students for Fair Admissions. And then I can later share who those other organizations were, but they were also are challenging the HSI program. In that complaint to dismiss, we also mentioned that the claims are basically moot because the Department of Education had reprogrammed the FY25 So how can these programs discriminate if there's no dollars for you to allocate? And so that same month, December 19th, which also happens to be my birthday, so thank you to Department of Ed for this horrible gift, is that the Department of Ed released a statement basically announcing that they agree with the Department of Justice legal opinion, which considered the HSI program and other programs, race-based grant programs, unconstitutional, and basically reasserted its actions against what it did back in September when it reprogrammed dollars to other to HBCUs, TCUs. And after that, in January of this year, we then also filed a broader motion against the lawsuit as a whole, saying that the state of Tennessee and Students for Fair Admissions do not have standing in this case. And the same thing that we mentioned in December 2nd, that the claims are basically moot because of what happened to the FY25. And then going back to some of the congressional champions, last month we also saw Senators Padilla, Sanders, and Murray lead senators urging the Department of Education to reverse its halt of MSI funding. Next slide. And so in addition to the congressional action and actions Haku has taken, there has also been a public campaign where HSIs have placed op-eds, earned media opportunities to talk about the importance of HSI. So one example is the San Diego Community College School District held a press conference with its students, and HSI representatives to talk about how important and central that program has been for San Diego. You had articles at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Because it was also HSI week when this reprogramming happened, HSIs used that as an opportunity to talk about what that funding and the consequences are looking like for them. Next slide. And then in regards to the congressional engagement that I mentioned, these are just snapshots from the website that I'll share later, where you'll be able to access those letters. But in addition to those letters, there were several members of Congress who released their uh, own response at a district, at a state level, condemning these actions. You also saw the Tri-Caucus join forces in regards to what happened with MSI funding. Next slide. Next slide. And then in addition to that, there are several higher education organizations and advocates that have released public statements in case you're curious of like who those stakeholders and allies are. The American Association of Community Colleges, Ed Excelencias, the state colleges and universities, EdTrust, the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, and school systems like the California State University system. Next slide. And so I also wanted to touch on real life examples of what these consequences look like. A school in California shared that they lost $3 million in grants that supported its two programs known as CASA and PASO. And the result of losing those $3 million resulted in reduced support for students facing food and housing insecurity. The loss of that funding also resulted in fewer counseling, advising, and wraparound services for adult learners. Another community college who had depended on this funding used the HSI dollars for online course development, mental health, peer coaching, and tutoring, math and English. It was designed to improve completion rates for working students in online programs. That loss of funding then resulted in reduced academic and mental health support, barriers to completion, and online pathways that they were hoping to extend. And then they also cited the limited access to flexible, high-quality education for working students at the community college. Next slide. Two more examples that I'll touch on is one institution that is an online institution this was the first time that they received the HSI dollars. And it was a 5-year plan, I believe. Is this the one? No, that'll be the second one. The last one, I'm sorry. But with this grant, it was geared towards supporting career services, mentoring, research, and curriculum development. The student population for the students attending the institution consisted of 48% Hispanic students, about 42% first-gen students, and 24.8% of their students were student parents. And so you can see that there is a significant overlap across high-need student groups. And so what this loss of funding resulted in is the elimination of comprehensive student support model that they were developing, the mentorship opportunity, and that long-term sustainability that they were hoping to build on. A HSI in Washington State was in their last year of their 5-year grant. They were, and those per year, the institutions received 600,000. That's the cap. They were going to use those 600,000 for biology lab renovations and IT infrastructure. what it resulted in is it disrupted the lab moderation. They had contracts already that they had relied on for this. And so now the institution had to scramble and figure out how they were going to cover those costs. And across all these examples, what I want to know is that the common narrative has been that HSI programs only support Hispanic students because of the name of Hispanic Serving Institution. The programs that institutions that receive this funding use these dollars to support all students. So for example, going back to the biology lab renovation, that does not necessarily mean that only Hispanic students are going to be in that physical lab. All students have access to that. Next slide. And so in regards to where we are today, advocates and stakeholders, as you can see, quickly sounded an alarm and asking Congress to continue funding for HSI programs and MSI programs. And so what we saw in Congress is that all programs that are identified as MSIs, ranging from the HSIs, the PBIs, and APZs, received funding. And then there were also certain guardrails set in place that would limit the administration's ability to reprogram or transferred some of the funding like it did back in September of 2025. Next slide. And another thing to flag, and Sarah mentioned this, is in addition to the uncertainty of where we'll see funding for FY26, but also as we prepare for 2027, another bucket is the interagency agreements. The Department of Ed moved the HSI program to Department of Labor, the ANAPISI program to Interior, the PBI programs to Labor, Native American serving non-tribal institutions to Interior, and Alaskan Native and Native Hawaiian serving institution program to Interior. So there's just a mix, and this causing confusion among the higher ed community on next steps. Next slide. And so as we think about the challenges ahead, as we prepare for FY27, when in my conversations with our HSI community and the broader MSI community, there's still no clarity on when or if Title V and III funds will be released. Funds could be reprogrammed and redirected, as I mentioned. There are rumors and suggestions that the funding for MSI, so over 350 million, could be reprogrammed to the SIP, the Strengthening Institution Program, but it has mixed reviews from the higher ed community. There are stakeholders who want each program, the HSI dollars, to be strictly for HSIs, PBIs for PBIs, ANAPZs for ANAPZs, and do not view the shift to a big SIP program as favorable. Congress has, in a bipartisan manner, funded these programs for decades, and there are stakeholders who would prefer to see the programs as is. As I mentioned, the interagency agreements are creating a lot of chaos and uncertainty, and institutions cannot plan or sustain programs without predictable funding. There are institutions that have relied on this funding for years, for at least 10 years. And when I say institutions, what I can also share is in 2025, of September 2025, when it comes to the HSI grants, there were 284 HSI grants that were canceled. Of those grants, 236 went to 2-year institutions. So these were community colleges. We're not talking about well-endowed institutions. These are institutions that are pillars in their communities and have relied on this money for years, if not decades. And I believe that is the last slide on my end. And so I'll pass it over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Xiomara, and I'm just amazed at how much lawsuit. I don't need my slides up yet, so I'm happy to take them down for a minute while we get started. So I'm going to start with a number that should stop everyone who is listening right now in your tracks. Congress appropriated nearly $800 million for education research last year, and more than 300 million of it may never be used. Let me say that one more time because it's going to stop you in your tracks. Congress appropriated $800 million for education research last year, and more than 300 million of it may never be used. So, Sarah, thank you so much for inviting me here to talk about what is and what is not happening at the Institute of Education Sciences. I refer to it as IES. As mentioned, Knowledge and Alliance is a coalition of the leading education organizations that partner with federal, state, and local education agencies to generate and apply rigorous evidence, support implementation of federal education programs, and strengthen the capacity of students to improve student outcomes. And for those of you who might not be familiar with IES, it is the statistics, research, and evaluation arm of the U.S. Department of Education. IES is independent, it's non-partisan, and their mission is to provide scientific evidence on which to ground education policy, to share this information in formats that are useful and accessible to educators, parents, policymakers, researchers, and the public. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. In February of 25, starting exactly where Xiomara started, the administration canceled slightly less than 100 IES contracts that supported surveys like the collection of EdFacts, IPEDS, NIPSAS, the condition of education, program evaluation, the regional educational laboratories. Additionally, out of an initial staff of nearly 200, fewer than 20. Did you hear me? An initial staff of 200, fewer than 20 remain following the reduction in force. And while some contracts, reduced in scope, were resuscitated not too long after the termination, other surveys and programs remain exactly as they were in February of 2025, terminated. Like the Early Child Longitudinal Survey. Did you want to know what the first cohort of COVID kindergartners were able to do? Don't know, that was terminated. Or the Teacher and Principal Survey, to know how much teachers are earning across this country and compare? Terminated. And while the regional education labs were restarted, much of the work they were involved in that Congress had invested prior to the termination could not be resuscitated given the nature of research. E.g., when they had been resuscitated, the school year had ended. So if last year felt like Armageddon, this year feels a little more like the glass is half full. The good news, Congress continues to fund IES, and the department may be moving in the same direction with a recently released report called IES 2.0. Should we be optimistic, you may be asking yourself? Well, there are still some major concerns. And that concern is about whether IES will spend their congressionally appropriated funding before it expires. And we're not just talking about a small sum here. Let me pause here and mention one important thing to know about IES is that funds appropriated by Congress to IES are unique in that they're available for 2 years, known as multi-year funding, to facilitate planning and execution of long-term research and longitudinal studies for complex data collections. Historically, IES has spent about 2/3 to 3/4 of its annual appropriations in its first year of availability. But I'm going to make the math easy for you here. If we say IES's annual appropriations are $800 million, IES spends roughly $600 million in the first year of availability and the remaining 200 million in the second year availability. That's been pretty consistent over time. And historically, and you can put up the first slide here, Ed has apportioned IES funding into program accounts like regional education labs, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, statewide longitudinal data systems, and R&D according to the chart that accompanies the annual appropriations bill. And let's take a look at this first chart illustrating that point. The total amount appropriated to IES, the blue bar here, matches the orange bar, how much was apportioned into the various program accounts. Well, we can go to the next slide. This is just as a reminder, this is what you would expect to see. So this is 2025. Remember that headline story I told you about the 300 million? Well, 793 minus 514 is about 300 million. That money is missing. It is missing, and I'm showing you in the program accounts where it's missing from. It's not really missing from NAEP. They have a little bit more than you might think. And NAGB has a little bit more. Special education research doesn't have what it should have been apportioned. Special education studies and evaluation, not there. The regional education labs, missing 17 million. Statistics, research, their orange bars should match their blue bars, but they do not. We can go to the next slide. Well, what I want to talk about this slide is in 2026 what happened. The chart above shows that what should have happened is the money should have been apportioned into accounts according to the congressional text, because that was actually written into law in the last appropriations bill. But you can see that 2026 looks a little worse than 2025. We have a lot more money missing. A lot more money missing. There's a longer time here because this money doesn't expire till September 30th, 2027. But one of the most concerning things is that in this latest LHHS bill, Congress said apportion the money according to the program accounts in the explanatory chart. But that has not happened. So, there's reasons to be concerned about this latest appropriations. And it's not just that something is happening at IES, it's that we can't clearly see what is happening at IES. There is no transparency around what is happening here. The good news, Congress continues to appropriate funds for IES. So the question's not whether the resources exist. The resources exist. It's whether those resources are being deployed in the ways Congress directed and in ways that sustain the nation's education, research, and data infrastructure. Because if not, these consequences are not abstract. We risk losing critical data collections that inform everything from college access to what Xiomara was just talking about to teacher workforce trends. We risk losing decades of longitudinal data comparisons. We risk dismantling important relationships that researchers and stakeholders and technical assistants have with their state partners. And once it's lost, it's really hard to rebuild it. So, in my opinion, this moment calls for clarity, accountability, and action. Thank you, Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, Xiomara, and Rachel for providing an overview of some of the different changes to federal education funding. My name is Yvette Arellano. I'm a policy assistant at the Learning Policy Institute and a co-chair of the CEF Research Committee. We are now transitioning to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So if you haven't already, please submit your questions to the Q&A little sidebar chat there. All right. So the first question that we have is for Xiomara. Xiomara, student loans were dramatically cut last year in the budget reconciliation bill, and then Ed pulled institutional support from minority serving institutions. We know that these actions cut both direct student aid and institutional support. So can you describe kind of how these changes will affect access to higher education?
Yeah, so, you know, we hear a lot of talk about wanting to increase access and opportunity and wanting to have a skilled and prepared workforce, but then you're taking resources from both sides. So students don't have less access to the financial means to attend these institutions, but now institutions that have made commitments and it's in their mission to want to help the their high risk population and students now don't have the capacity to do that, to provide the wraparound services, to use the funding that they had dedicated to, those centers that I described that provided those wraparound services. That has resulted in, schools eliminating positions or having to reshuffle, for the last year, it was very sad to get on LinkedIn. And in addition to the federal employees who were laid off, what I also saw was as a result of this, the funding reshifting and the funding cuts, is people announcing that their position was removed and, having conversations with HSI stakeholders about what it looks like ahead. Uh, there were school districts that mentioned that there could be up to 100 or 300 positions in their school district alone that they would have to cancel or reevaluate or even consider shutting down more of their centers because of the millions of dollars that have been reprogrammed or canceled.
Great. Thank you, Xiomara, for kind of shedding a light on the different impacts that, we saw as a good education community. Um, Rachel, this next question is for you. We see that many programs rely on IES data to calculate formulas for state grant funding. And as you had mentioned, you and Sarah mentioned earlier, we've seen that Ed has already lost half of its staff. What kind of problems do you foresee with one, still some executive staff being at Ed? Then we have funding flowing through other agencies, grant mechanisms. We also have far fewer staffers that are still there and familiar with the programs and data. So what kind of problems do you see with those three things happening concurrently?
Yes. So EdFax, which is the backbone of all the title formula funding, was terminated and resuscitated. But if you go in publicly available information sets, you'll see that the contract was cut significantly. And then the question becomes, what's no longer there? And I can't tell you what's no longer there because I am not going to FOIA a contract. But one of the things that is easy to see is no longer there is the help desk. And let me tell you, I've heard from state data coordinators who are responsible for submitting EdFax data to the government that they no longer have a phone number that they can call to ask questions to. There's an email address, but I don't know if you've worked in a state education office or tried to submit data to the federal government for accountability purposes or for title purposes. It's much easier, and they've had such great things to say about the help desk, and it's not there. And I'm sure people are doing their best through email to provide the supports to the states. But I think when we think about what is needed and what impact that will have on the data quality, the timeliness, the submission, I think those people who have concerns about that, it's fair. It's fair to be concerned.
And kind of on the topic of IES, could you remind us of just the kinds of research that IES has generated in the past and the type of impact that it has on students?
Sure. I think one of the most viral things to happen in education research has been Emily Hanford's Sold a Story, which if you haven't listened to that podcast, you absolutely should. And we've seen lots of movement in the science of reading. And the science of reading was generated and originated through funding at IES. And that was one of the first things that they heavily invested in when they were originated in 2002. And so when you talk about changes to student achievement and student reading and the science of literacy just now starting to gain hold, that research came from IES. And there's so much more we need to know. We need to know about AI. What math do students need to know? What are different conditions for whom and where of what works? We need replication studies. We have a good body of generalized knowledge, which is fair and great, and let's keep moving it forward. So yes, there's really important work to be done.
Thank you for that, Rachel, for just reminding us of the importance of everything that IES does. Here we go. Let's see. Xiomara, another question for you. So this year, as we saw, included really significant changes to how federal support for MSIs is structured, including the absence of dedicated funding and a shift in program administration from the Department of Education to other federal agencies. How might these changes affect program implementation and institutional capacity? That's the first question. I'm gonna put it's a two-question answer. Um, and then do you just anticipate any challenges as agencies like, the Department of Labor, the Department of Interior, just try to adapt to administering these programs, particularly when we're looking at ensuring continuity and effective support for students and campuses?
Yeah, so the short answer is that there are no answers. We haven't received any direct response from both the Department of Education or the Department of Labor, the Department of Interior on how these programs are going to operate. Are they going to follow the same reporting application portals, and individuals whose job is to apply for federal grants know how difficult and the learning curve that it takes to, it may sound silly, but making sure that you use Times New Roman, 12 font, everything. It's a very tedious job to do, and there's just a lot of uncertainty. I know that institutions of higher ed have asked these questions of various departments on what's next. There still haven't been any direct response. My understanding is that there's a portal that the Department of Ed and Department of Labor have that are supposed to answer the questions, but the questions haven't been answered in those portals. And so I think it's up to us to continue asking those questions, not only as the direct stakeholders who want to apply for the funding, because Congress did appropriate funding for all MSI programs. Now it's the Department of Ed needs to announce what its intentions are. Whether are you going to release the funding for each individual MSI program? Are you looking to shift it into the SIP and create a larger SIP? Because it is a very, very, long, complicated application process for these institutions. And again, we're not talking about institutions that have large endowments. We're talking about regional institutions, community colleges that have already lost millions of dollars and are looking for ways to continue serving their student body population. And so, at least on Haku's behalf, what I can share is that we are having a fly-in later next month, and we'll have a little over 200 advocates that are representatives of HSI. Students are also coming. And so we'll be asking those questions from the administration, but also making sure that our members of Congress understand the real world consequences that we are seeing every day.
Appreciate you sharing about the fly-in and appreciate all the work that you and Taku are doing on behalf of your students. Thank you, Xiomara. All right. Sarah, we have a question for you. What do you suggest congressional staff can do to help prepare their bosses for this year's appropriation cycle? And can you tell us a little more about what CEF will be doing this cycle?
I am happy to talk about this. So I think my general advice as a former Hill staffer is to be informed. Uh, I will tout CEF's resources because I think that can be very helpful. First of all, we have our budget book that lists has the it's nominally about the president's budget request, but really what it is an encyclopedia of education funding programs. And so if you've got to want to learn about what a program does or how it works, you can read an article about it by the CEF member who is an expert, and you have contact information for that. And then you can find it on cef.org. In the lower right-hand corner, there's a gray box that said budget book. And we'll be doing a new budget book once we get the president's fiscal year 27 request. I'm also happy to send CF's membership directory to any Hill staff who want it if they want to reach out to someone. But really, this is the opportunity for members of Congress to hear from their constituents. And so I would encourage you to encourage them to go visit colleges and workforce programs and school districts in their district or state, because they're going to hear earful from their constituents about why federal funding makes a difference to these programs. And I think a field trip it's not a field trip, a site visit is always you can learn so much more from that than you can from any of the really informative letters that we will write to you. I also think you still have a week in the case of the House and about a month for the Senate to put in your requests for labor HHS. They can be programmatic and they can be language. And one of the, there was I gather a battle behind the scenes when Congress was working on the omnibus appropriations for fiscal year 26. And one of the last items to be settled for fiscal year 26 labor HHS ed was the level of guardrails that the language could be in the bill. And there was language that said you need to report to us every few weeks about things. You need to apportion the money on time. When we say shall be provided, it didn't say it this way, but when we say shall be provided on July 1st, we mean shall be provided on July 1st, because we saw last year that didn't happen for a bunch of the state formula grants where there is no room for Department of Ed to decide something. The formula says how much each state gets, and then the states get it. There was also language about following Congress's direction. So when Congress says there shall be provided for this program this amount, then the Department of Ed shall do it. The question, of course, is going to be, there's also language in the report, which is not the same thing as the bill, addressing the interagency agreements. And there's a lot of difference of opinion about whether that is a good or bad idea. The department says that this is part of returning education to the states. I find it hard to understand how making a college or a state agency, education agency, now go to 4 different agencies to apply for their money is actually doing anything to reduce administrative burden or make it easier to access this funding. It may require more time on the grantee side to figure out these different different platforms, and also to see when things are being announced. We have a lot of worries that this is going to impact the flow of support of education to the grantees. In this case, sometimes it's states, sometimes it's colleges, sometimes it's people who've applied for a competitive grant for a particular purpose.
Great. Thank you for sharing, Sarah. So one final question for all of our finalists. As the administration continues to issue executive orders and regulations dealing with education, and as Congress starts the FY27 funding cycle and, awaits the president's budget request, is there one key item you'd like to see, or one takeaway about the value of investments in education that the government needs to, at the very least, maintain? And I'm happy to throw it to whoever wants to answer first.
I will jump in and just say that, my 2 main takeaways for this are that the chaos and uncertainty about funding means that there will be a loss of education jobs. For some rural districts, the school or the community college is the largest employer. When the federal funding is cut, as Xiomara talked about, people lose their jobs. We've seen colleges end certain programs entirely. They've done hiring freezes. They've restricted students who can come in. I think some school districts are going to cut back the number of teachers and paraprofessionals that they employ because they won't know if they're going to get their federal funding on time or in what level. I also think that just want to remind Congress or members of Congress or the public that all of this that is happening does not reflect what the majority of the public wants. The public wants more education investment, not less.
I guess I can go next. And I will say that federal funding for education research and technical assistance and the data fuels student success. And it is the engine that drives, in partnership with states, parents, and communities, improve student outcomes. And you don't want to have a dry engine because then none of the other parts are going to work. So thank you, Congress, for continuing to see that investments in education fuel student success. And we hope that we can continue to ensure that we understand this and try and elevate the importance of this across government.
I also want to echo the thanks to, members of Congress who really stood firm in protecting the federal investments when it comes to minority serving institutions and other higher ed programs. My main takeaway is what I mentioned earlier about, we talk about wanting to have a prepared, skilled workforce, but if we're taking resources from being able to provide students the opportunity to attend these institutions, and then removing resources from the institutions that want to provide the wraparound services, we're not going to be able to do that. So really wanting the administration to understand that you can't attack student aid and the resources providing the resources to institutions wanting to build that skilled workforce, because the results aren't going to be great. And then in the long run, we're going to need studies on that. And now we currently don't have the funding or opportunities to have those studies.
Well, thanks to all of you, and thank you, Yvette, for handling the Q&A. I think, CEF tries to provide briefings for Hill staff and the public that we think highlight key areas where federal investment is important and also key areas where there are really big changes afoot. We are happy to share information. I put a bunch of things in the chat for this briefing with links to CEF's website, which is cef.org. We are always happy to answer questions and direct people to the CEF member who is an expert. We have members who cover virtually every federal education program. So thanks to all of the panelists. You represent an amazing wealth of knowledge. We are very lucky to have the breadth of representation that we do in CEF. And we will have this up on our website as soon as possible, hopefully tomorrow, and I will send some follow-up information to everybody who registered. But thank you all very much, and feel free to be in touch. Thanks again.